talking about your ancestor that was in the Civil War, and you said
I
something
got
to
a
the
lot of
effect
stories
of
like that.
the
Yeah.
South are the good guys. And when you said
hmm
that, I was like, well, I don't take everything you say 100%, Ryan, because you have very similar humor to what I find funny. And I know you weren't serious, but can you explain why you said that in terms of the Confederacy?
Well, there's no like good guys, bad guys, but in any war, it's the poor fighting the poor. That's what happens. And the Civil War was a banker war, just like every other war. The spin on it is, oh, this is like 100 years after they start saying, oh yeah, the Civil War was fought to end slavery,
Yeah.
which is about as accurate as saying we went into Afghanistan for women's liberation, or we invaded Iraq because we felt sympathy for the Kurds. And you could point to very um, real life statistics on how, yeah, women don't have rights in Afghanistan, and the Kurds were an oppressed minority in Iraq, but it has nothing to do with why we went to war. We went to war in Afghanistan to control opium because it's used as an off the books budgetary item that can finance illegal activities like sponsoring Al Qaeda and terrorist groups in Syria. And we went to war in Iraq because a bunch of neocons of Israeli partisans lied and dragged us into war because Saddam Hussein was supporting Palestinians. There's nothing to do with it. And the Civil War was because the North invaded the South. The South didn't attack the North. The South seceded from the North. It's the North that attacked. And I can summarize the causes real fast. I can send you a video on it with all the details and stuff. But essentially,
Please do.
the main reason for Southerners to fight the Civil War was they were being attacked. The main reasons for secession is different than the reason for a war, because they were not planning to go to war with the United States. Lincoln was. He procured the entire U.S. Navy prior. He was planning on doing this. He put a naval blockade on 3 of his own states, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. North Carolina and Virginia had not seceded yet. And had they not seceded, there is no Civil War, because that was half the Southern population was Virginia and Carolinas. The first shots are at Fort Sumter, where they were collecting the new import-export taxes. And that's what they were fighting for. You had 25% of the population paying 87% of the taxes, and almost the entire revenue was being dumped into New York and Boston and Philly, and it wasn't being spent on the South at all. And the tariffs that they put on imports from Europe were bad in and of themselves, and it resulted in mirrored tariffs by Europeans on American goods on cotton and tobacco, but that only affects one area. New York doesn't care if there's a huge tax on cotton because they're not making cotton. They're buying cotton from the South, who would be forced to sell to them because they can't sell to the Europeans. On top of that, they got taxed to export their goods as well, which benefited the North because they're not exporting textiles to Europe. Europe's way more advanced on textiles. They've been established a lot longer. It was the economic reasons. The other one was they were competing from railroads between Chicago to San Francisco and New Orleans to San Francisco. It didn't matter about slaves. 5 northern states had slaves and fought on the Union side. When the 13th Amendment came to be ratified, 3 northern states refused. You didn't just lose more than 500,000 people and then not sign to ratify the amendment that would liberate slaves. Also, there's the Corbin Amendment prior to the Civil War ever starting, not a single shot fired, where they enshrined slavery in the Constitution, and it was the North had already signed it. All the South had to do was sign it. But to sign it, they'd have to stay in the Union, and every single one of them refused. So it can't be about slavery. When Lincoln personally wrote every governor and said, if you your state needs to stay in, if you sign this document, we're not going to mess with the institution of slavery. That's how badly Lincoln wanted. Lincoln wasn't pro-slavery. He wanted whites and blacks to be completely separate. It was worse. He was a send them back to Africa guy, or send them to South America guy.
Can I just ask, because this is a lot to process, Ryan. Where did you get that info about Lincoln?
Oh, I've got lots of books on Lincoln. The Corbin Amendment, you can look it up. I mean, okay. Lincoln personally wrote Corbin Amendment, and it said that they weren't going to mess with labor, which included slavery, if they would stay in the Union, and they all refused. Virginia was split in half. I mean, that's why we have West Virginia, but the western part of Virginia was not affected by the tariff so much because they're not on the coast and they're not on the Mississippi River. So it didn't matter for that part of the state. And so they were Americans and they stayed in the Union, although they did have slaves. Kentucky had slaves. Delaware had slaves. Washington, D.C., the capital of the North, had slaves. Grant had slaves. The general, the Union general, he had slaves. Robert E. Lee freed his slaves. So it wasn't like that. And East Tennessee and Western North Carolina tried to remain pretty neutral. Parts of Maryland were Southern, parts were Northern. It wasn't even really clear. And they'll talk about the Mason-Dixon line, but that doesn't divide the North and South from the Civil War.
Yeah.
But and a lot of
thanks for that,
Southerners that are
Ryan.
fighting the war are not.
Yeah, go
they
ahead.
didn't have any slaves. They're poor as hell. Like, they don't benefit from it either. I mean, think about how much they complain now of just having cheap labor from Mexico, whatever. Try having free labor. Can't compete with that. It was bad, but Lincoln would say things like he didn't want blacks and whites to mix blood. He didn't want any of the new territories to be slaveholding, not because of how abhorrent slavery is, but because he didn't want blacks and whites to live together, period. And none of them were. Slavery was on its way out anyway, globally, and you didn't have to have a massive fight to get rid of it anywhere else. But they made it an issue in the middle of the war to help keep European powers from siding with the South and joining the war. They tried to make some moral veneer and make it about slavery, which kind of backfired because a lot of people in the Union Army were like, I'm not fighting for that, and
yeah. That is a lot to process, and I'm definitely going to do my due diligence on reading about that, because something like that just, it like shifts your whole perspective on such a huge event, that it takes time, I think, to process that sort of new information.
It is, but the largest race riots in history were in New York City during the Civil War, where they went around hanging black people. Custer went west and murdered Native Americans right after the war, and they enslaved the Chinese. So it's not like the North was some anti-racist utopia or something. They hated black people. They hated American Indians. They didn't even consider them people. The final solution is not from Hitler. It's from William Tecumseh Sherman. The same man that burned Atlanta wanted to kill every Indian. He's also the guy that only good Indian's a dead Indian. He did Wounded Knee. General Custer went out all the way to Little Bighorn. He was defeated by Crazy Horse, but he tried to murder them all. And they'll say, oh, the Chinese weren't slaves. Yeah, they were. And they're paid in script. And
they made the railways.
The half from the west to the east, and they used blacks and Irish to build from the east to the west.